Okay, so today we're going to jump into feminist philosophy of law. And I think with your background in philosophy, this will be right up your alley.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on it,
Yeah.
which is a pretty recent one. It was published on March 5th, 2025, so it's very up to date.
Oh, wow. Very recent. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to try to extract the main arguments of this field
Okay.
and look at, how feminist thinkers analyze legal theories, institutions, and reforms,
Right.
always through this lens of sex, gender, and patriarchy, kind of seeing how all of those things impact how we view the law.
Yeah. That's really interesting. How that kind of shapes everything in the background, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you'll agree that it offers a fresh and, I don't know, maybe even a revolutionary way to think about some of these concepts that we might already be familiar with.
Yeah. And I think for me, coming from philosophy, it really is looking at how these frameworks are presented as being objective and neutral, but actually they might have all these assumptions about gender that we're not really aware of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So have you ever thought about how some of these, principles that seem very neutral are actually based on ideas about gender that we just haven't really examined?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I'm really curious to get into, the nitty gritty of all this.
Yeah, me too. So let's get into it. And I think a good place to start is, how does feminist legal philosophy actually define what law is?
Yeah, that's a great starting point.
Right.
And in traditional legal philosophy, we have this debate between natural law and legal positivism.
Right.
So natural law is like the idea that law is tied up with morality.
Right.
Legal positivism says, no, it's just social facts.
Okay, those are like the classic debates in jurisprudence.
Exactly. So what's interesting is that feminist legal theorists haven't really engaged with that debate as much.
Okay.
They've kind of taken a different perspective on what law is kind of stepping outside of that debate.
So instead of saying whether or not law should be moral, they're kind of looking at how it already embodies certain gendered ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what assumptions are we making about gender when we even think about what law is?
Right.
And this is where a concept like Sally Haslinger's ameliorative justice comes in,
Okay.
which is from metaphysics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it basically suggests that when we define concepts like law,
Right.
we should do it in a way that helps us fix injustices.
Oh, okay.
So in this case, it'd be like the injustices caused by patriarchy throughout history.
Ameliorative justice applied to law. That's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, it's not just about, analyzing the law, but also actively trying to redefine it to make it more just when it comes to gender.
Okay, so we're not just analyzing law, but we're kind of actively trying to reshape it.
Exactly. And, even something like the positivist idea of separating law from morality,
Right.
which can be useful for objective analysis, can be used in a feminist critique as well.
Okay.
Because by separating those two, you can start to see where interpretations of rights, like liberty under the U.S. Constitution's Due Process Clause, might be relying on masculinist norms.
Oh,
Like, for instance, look at scholars like Reva Siegel and Leslie Francis.
Yep.
They've shown how this separation actually reveals gendered assumptions in these seemingly neutral legal principles.
Oh, wow. So it's kind of like a new lens to look at constitutional interpretation through.
Exactly. Yeah, it really allows you to see things in a different way.
It's like uncovering something that's been there the whole time.
Yeah.
Okay, so law isn't just about rules or universal morality.
Right.
It's also this place where gender dynamics are kind of operating, sometimes invisibly, to shape how it works.
Absolutely.
What about something like the rule of law?
Right.
A lot of people think that's essential for a fair system. What does feminist philosophy say about that?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So the rule of law is usually understood as, being governed by these norms that are general, clear, public, and, applied consistently.
Right, so it's not just like, individuals making up the rules as they go along.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, you can think of thinkers like Hayek, Fuller, Dworkin, who are all about that ideal of the rule of law as a way to protect against, arbitrary power.
Yes, a system of law is not of man.
Right, exactly. But feminist legal scholars point out that there's this big potential problem with this ideal.
Okay.
They say that focusing on consistency can actually end up reinforcing power dynamics that are already unequal.
So how does that work? Because if the laws are applied consistently to everyone, how does inequality come in?
Well, the argument, and this is something scholars like Anne Scales and Catherine McKinnon have really pushed, is that If the existing norms are already shaped by patriarchy,
Right.
then applying them consistently is just going to solidify those inequalities further.
I see.
It's like the law itself can become this way of normalizing dominant norms, presenting them as objective truths,
Right.
which makes bias really hard to see and to challenge, not just for judges, but for everyone.
Yeah, for everyone involved.
Exactly. And thinkers like Martha Minow and Deborah Rowe,
Yeah.
they really highlight how the rule of law could actually preserve inequality instead of preventing it.
It's kind of a paradox, right?
Yeah, it is. It's like the very thing meant to protect against unfairness can end up hiding the unfairness and making it harder to fight.
Yeah, that is pretty disturbing.
Mm.
Okay, so the rule of law that we think of as being this kind of neutral arbiter can actually be used to perpetuate inequalities.
Yes, exactly. It challenges the idea that law is truly neutral.
Right. So let's move on to judges then, because they're the ones who are interpreting these laws,
Right.
and their interpretation can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And feminist philosophy offers a really critical perspective on how judges go about doing their job.
Okay.
So you have the traditional legal positivist view from Hart that says in tough cases where the law isn't clear, judges kind of have to make new law within the framework.
Okay.
Natural law folks say judges should look to moral principles when interpreting law.
Right. So where do feminist thinkers fit in with all of this?
Well, they definitely point out that unconscious bias can influence any interpretation. But they also have a really sharp critique of specific interpretive approaches like originalism, especially in constitutional law.
Right, originalism.
Yeah.
So that's the idea that we should interpret legal texts like constitutions based on what they meant when they were first adopted.
Exactly.
So the argument there is that this kind of constrains judges. It prevents them from just imposing their own personal views.
That's the main argument, yeah. Like someone like William Bode would say that.
Okay.
But feminist critics like Marianne Case and Reva Siegel argue that originalism can actually entrench patriarchal values.
Okay, how so?
Well, by looking to the past for fixed meanings, you might end up solidifying past injustices.
Right.
Because those past communities might have had very different ideas about gender, often more explicitly hierarchical.
I see.
Siegel's analysis of the Dobbs decision on abortion rights, it's a
Right.
great example. She argues that originalism there basically anchored the interpretation in this imagined past,
Okay.
that reinforced outdated norms about gender that are actually harmful to women's equality.
So even though the argument is that it restricts judicial overreach, it could also lock in historical inequality.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a really important point, especially with all the debates going on about constitutional interpretation.
It is, yeah. And it shows how looking to the past isn't always the answer.
Right, it might just bring the past's injustices into the present.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about equality.
Yeah.
It's such a basic concept in law, but it gets really complicated when you look at it through a feminist lens.
Absolutely. And feminist thinkers have a lot of different perspectives on this.
Okay.
Liberal feminists often talk about procedural equality, which means treating like cases alike and different cases differently based on relevant differences.
Okay, so treat similar situations similarly and different situations differently.
Right. But the big question is what counts as a relevant difference?
Right, who decides what's relevant and what's not?
Exactly. And this is where the whole distinction between biological sex and gender identity becomes super important. We're seeing this play out in debates about gender transition and the role of medicine.
Right.
Like in May 2024, the Czech Constitutional Court said that surgery shouldn't be a requirement for legal gender transition,
Okay.
which shows a growing recognition of the difference between assigned sex and lived gender identity.
Yeah.
But then you have areas like sports where there's this huge debate about whether categories should be based on biological traits
Right.
or on an individual's gender identity.
And those biological traits are complex too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not simple at all. And the International Olympic Committee is trying to navigate this with their 2021 framework that focuses on competitive advantage but leaves the final decision to individual sports.
Okay.
And then you have cases like Semenya v. Switzerland, which is still ongoing,
Right.
about a female athlete with differences in sex development, and that just highlights how complicated this all is.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these abstract ideas play out in real life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you have difference feminists like Martha Minow,
Okay.
who argue that true equality means taking into account all these different physical, historical, social differences when making laws and policies.
Okay, so you can't just treat everyone the same on the surface. You have to consider the context.
Exactly. But this creates what Minow calls the dilemmas of difference.
Okay, what's that?
Well, how do we acknowledge real differences without reinforcing stereotypes or creating new inequalities?
Right. That's tricky.
A classic example is pregnancy leave.
Yeah.
Do you give leave for pregnancy, which is this biological reality that only affects women, or does that give women an unfair advantage?
Right.
Minnow's solution is to first recognize the underlying norms that already disadvantage women.
Oh,
Like, in the US, there's no universal paid family leave, which reflects a societal norm that doesn't value caregiving.
right, which usually falls on women.
Exactly. And Sophia Moreau argues that this unequal impact of seemingly neutral norms is a form of indirect discrimination.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not about treating everyone the same on the surface, it's about addressing the underlying inequalities.
All right, so you have to look deeper.
Exactly. And feminists also point out that historically we've exaggerated biological sex differences and ignored the social construction of gender.
Okay.
But the impact of pregnancy is still real, and it's often dismissed in legal contexts.
Right.
Like in the Dobbs decision, Justice Alito basically said that lack of abortion access wouldn't really impact women differently,
Wow.
which feminist scholars have criticized as reflecting a jurisprudence of masculinity.
A jurisprudence of masculinity. What does that mean?
Well, it's this idea from Melissa Murray that the law prioritizes rights associated with men
Okay.
and ignores those related to women's reproductive capabilities.
Right.
So Dobbs is a really clear example of how gendered assumptions can shape these really fundamental rights.
It seems like it's taking a very male-centric view of the situation.
It does. And then you have a lot of contemporary feminists who critique the very idea of using biological sex to define legal gender identity.
Oop.
They argue that laws that use sex assigned at birth to determine legal sex, like for segregated housing or bans on gender-affirming care.
Okay.
Those laws actually reinforce harmful gender binaries and echo these old protective laws that limited women's autonomy.
I see.
So the Bostock v. Clayton County decision in 2020 was a big step forward.
Right.
It extended protection against sex discrimination in employment to include sexual orientation and gender identity,
Okay.
which a lot of feminists praised, but some conservatives criticized on originalist grounds.
Right, so there's that tension again.
Exactly. And the EU has similar protections under Article 21 and Directive 2007/8/EC.
Okay, so this is kind of a global movement towards more inclusive understandings of discrimination.
It is, yeah. But it's definitely still contested.
Okay, so the feminist perspective really makes us rethink not just how we understand equality, but also the categories of sex and gender that the law often relies on.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to another concept that pops up all the time in law reasonableness.
Oh, yeah. Reasonableness standards are everywhere in law. You find them in criminal law, torts, contracts, employment law.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. And traditionally, the standard was the reasonable man.
Right.
Now it's shifted to the reasonable person, which seems more neutral.
Yeah.
But feminist philosophers have been asking whether male norms still influence this supposedly objective standard.
So it's like, even though it's a reasonable person, that person is still being imagined in a kind of male way.
Yeah, exactly. And this has implications for how the law is applied.
Okay.
Social justice tort theorists point out that damages in tort law can reinforce disparities that affect women.
Okay, can you give an example?
Sure, like Martha Chamelis shows how depressed wages for certain kinds of work,
Right.
which often affect women,
Yeah.
can end up impacting the damages they receive in court.
Oh, I see.
So the seemingly neutral standard of reasonableness is actually operating in a biased way.
Right.
Other feminist tort scholars want to broaden the idea of harm to include things like technological and environmental issues,
Okay.
which can have really different gendered impacts. And then in contract law, you have scholars critiquing the traditional model of freedom to bargain, because that model doesn't really take into account the power imbalances between men and women.
Right. So even though it seems like everyone's entering into a contract freely,
Right.
there might be these underlying inequalities that are forcing one party to accept terms that aren't really in their best interest.
Exactly. And then you have feminist critiques of the whole reason versus emotion dichotomy in law,
Yeah.
pointing out that women's emotions are often dismissed as irrational or stereotyped,
Right.
which can lead to unfair outcomes in things like rules of evidence.
So something that seems like a very objective standard, like reasonableness,
Right.
is actually shaped by all these gender biases.
It is. And it makes you think twice about how neutral the law really is.
It does. Okay, so let's talk about another big idea in liberal legal thought, the distinction between public and private spheres.
Yeah, this is a really important one. And it's one where feminist philosophy of law offers a really powerful challenge. So liberals, and this includes a lot of liberal feminists,
Right.
They often want a clear separation between public and private,
Okay.
with the private sphere being this area of individual choice free from state interference.
Right. The classic liberal idea that what you do in your own home is your business.
Exactly. And this ties into the harm principle.
The idea that the law should only step in if you're harming someone else.
Exactly. But radical and dominance feminists offer a different perspective.
Okay, what do they say?
They say that the home isn't always a safe space. It can actually be a place where harm occurs, most notably domestic violence.
Right, and that violence is often hidden because it's happening in this supposedly private space.
Exactly, which is why the feminist slogan, "the personal is political," is so powerful.
Yeah, it challenges that whole idea that what happens in the home is just a private matter.
It does. But then intersectional feminists add another layer of complexity.
Okay.
They point out that while some feminists are worried about state intrusion for marginalized women, state intervention can be really dangerous.
Okay. How so?
Well, think about things like police searches or welfare checks
Right.
for women of color or poor women. These interventions can be discriminatory and even deadly.
Right, like the cases of Breonna Taylor and Shirley Lyles.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the experience of the private sphere and the fear of the state aren't the same for everyone.
Right, the private sphere isn't this safe haven for everyone.
Exactly. And then the concept of privacy also includes things like decisions about family reproduction sexuality.
Right.
And those are at the heart of debates about abortion rights and marriage equality.
Right, where the law gets really involved in what seem like personal choices.
Exactly. So feminist philosophy challenges us to think critically about how we define these spheres and who benefits from that definition.
Okay, so these themes that we've been discussing are kind of the foundation for understanding how feminist legal philosophy approaches specific areas of law.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of those areas now, starting with human rights, citizenship, and political equality.
Okay. So the international human rights framework has been really important in advancing equality for women globally.
Right, yeah.
You have instruments like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR,
Okay.
and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW.
Right, CEDAW, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, those are key. And then you have things like the Palermo Protocol, which addresses trafficking,
Yeah.
and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there's been this big push for commitments to equality, on paper at least.
Yeah, it seems like there's been a lot of progress internationally in recognizing women's rights.
There has, but critical feminists point out that things on the ground can be very different.
Okay.
They argue that in a lot of places, these commitments are superficial.
Okay.
They mask the fact that patriarchal laws and practices are still deeply entrenched.
Right, so just because a country signs a treaty doesn't mean they actually enforce it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in some cultures, women still face huge restrictions on their rights. The Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan is a tragic example of how fragile progress can be.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of what can happen.
It is. And then there's also the debate about whether rights are the best way to address oppression.
Okay.
Some feminists argue that the human rights discourse focuses too much on the public sphere
Okay.
and ignores the more subtle forms of oppression that happen in private.
I see.
But then critical race theorists like Patricia Williams argue that rights are absolutely essential for marginalized communities.
Right, so it's a complex issue with different perspectives.
It is. And then when you look at the history of feminist legal reform in the U.S.,
Okay.
you see a similar complexity.
Yeah.
The early focus was on dismantling explicit legal barriers to equality, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg did.
Right.
But then you have the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA,
Okay.
which failed to get ratified.
Right.
And that shows how deep the disagreements are about what gender equality really means.
Yeah, there were concerns from both conservatives and some feminists.
Exactly. And globally, the debates go beyond just formal equality.
Okay.
CEDAW aims to eliminate all forms of discrimination,
Right.
which is a huge goal. And then you have the whole question of cultural differences and whether international norms are imposing Western values.
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
It is. And feminist political philosophers have been grappling with these cross-cultural issues for a long time.
Right.
And then you have the whole area of asylum and refugee law,
Okay.
which feminist scholars have shown often relies on male-centered models of persecution
Okay.
that overlook the specific injustices that women face.
Like gender-based violence or persecution?
Exactly. Yeah, so it's a really broad and complex area with a lot of different feminist perspectives.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to marriage, which has seen some big legal changes recently.
Yeah, definitely.
Um,
So same-sex marriage is becoming more and more recognized globally.
right, starting with Denmark back in 1989.
Yeah, and then the Netherlands in 2001.
And the U.S. in 2015 with Obergefell v. Hodges.
Right.
Exactly. It's been a big shift.
It has. But as we've seen with cases like three Creative LLC v. Linus, marriage equality doesn't always translate into broader equality.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And some feminists actually critique the institution of marriage itself.
Okay. In what way?
They argue that it can be inherently unequal
Okay.
and that valuing it so much harms people who choose or are in other types of relationships.
Right.
So they say if we really want to get rid of gender inequality and support different forms of intimacy,
Right.
we might need to rethink marriage entirely.
Wow. That's a pretty radical critique of something that's often seen as a progressive step.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's an important perspective to consider.
Okay, so let's talk about reproductive rights, which is another area of huge debate.
Yeah, absolutely. So access to contraception is crucial for women's reproductive autonomy.
Right.
But that access is very uneven globally.
Yeah, a 2020 UN report showed that.
Right. There are all sorts of barriers, cultural norms, costs, misinformation.
Yeah.
And this is especially true in places like sub-Saharan Africa. And even in the U.S., cost can be a barrier.
Definitely. And feminists point out that the burden of contraception falls mostly on women.
Yeah.
So they're pushing for more male responsibility in family planning and for better male contraceptive methods.
Right, because it takes two.
It does. And then when you look at abortion rights, it's even more complicated.
Yeah. The global landscape is all over the place.
It is. You have everything from constitutional protection in some countries to total bans in others.
Right.
It varies across Europe, Canada, Australia, South Africa, the whole African continent.
Yeah. So many different approaches.
Exactly. And then in the U.S., you have the Dobbs decision in 2022.
Right, which overturned Roe v. Wade.
Exactly. And now there's this patchwork of state laws, some with very strict bans.
Yeah.
And this has raised concerns about things like criminal prosecutions for self-managed abortions.
That's a really stark example of how the law can impact people's personal choices and bodily autonomy.
It is. And feminists emphasize that reproductive choices are constrained by so many things. Not just the law, but also patriarchal norms, social and economic circumstances.
Right. So even if abortion is legal, it might not be accessible for everyone.
Exactly. There's coercion, there's sex-selective abortion, there's economic instability, all these factors.
Yeah.
And then you have some conservative feminists who argue that easy access to abortion might lead to less responsible attitudes towards sex.
Okay.
And then there's the whole question of religion and deeply held beliefs.
Yeah.
Which makes this a really challenging issue for the law to deal with.
Especially in societies with strong religious or customary legal traditions.
Right. It's incredibly complex.
Okay. And we can't talk about reproductive rights without talking about reproductive justice.
Absolutely. That's a crucial framework developed by feminists of color.
Right.
Like the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective.
Yeah.
They say it's not just about the right to not have children, but also the right to have children and to raise them in safe and healthy environments.
But it's much broader than just abortion.
It is. It connects reproductive rights to things like healthcare, housing, food security, all these things.
Right, so it's about the conditions in which people are making these choices.
Exactly. And it critiques these narrow approaches that focus just on abortion.
Right.
And then even within infertility care, there are all these feminist controversies.
Okay, like what?
Well, should society support people's desire for genetically or gestationally related offspring?
Okay.
What are the ethics of IVF? What about adoption?
Yeah.
Can you deny infertility treatment based on relationship status or ability?
Those are big questions.
They are. And then there's gamete provision and surrogacy.
Okay.
Some feminists say the term donation hides the commodification of bodies.
Interesting.
You have these neoliberal arguments for voluntary paid services.
Right.
But then feminist critiques about exploitation and degradation.
Yeah.
And then there's the rapid pace of technology in this area.
Yeah.
Things like pre-implantation, genetic diagnosis, mitochondrial DNA transplants, gene editing.
Wow. It's a lot to keep up with.
There are concerns about safety and ethical implications.
Right.
But then liberal feminists say we should respect individual choices about reproductive risks.
Okay, so a lot of different viewpoints then.
Yeah. And then surrogacy laws vary hugely globally.
Right.
Some places ban it, others allow it, some allow payment, some don't. Right. It's a mess. And there are concerns about cross-border surrogacy and exploitation.
So a lot of ethical and legal challenges in that area.
Definitely. Okay, let's talk about prostitution, another really controversial issue.
Yeah, and one where Feminist perspectives are all over the place.
Absolutely. So you have liberal feminists who disagree about whether prostitution is a free choice or something that needs legal intervention.
Okay.
Some say it's consensual sex work, a legitimate economic choice.
Right.
Others worry about coercion, especially because of economic vulnerability.
Right.
They question how voluntary it really is.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole debate about the link to sex trafficking.
Okay.
Some say prohibition protects trafficking victims. Others point to countries with legalized prostitution like the Netherlands and Germany and say it has mixed results.
Right.
And then there's the Nordic model in Sweden, which criminalizes buying sex but not selling it.
Okay, so different approaches with different goals.
Exactly. And some feminists say that criminalizing sex work in any form harms sex workers.
How so?
Well, it might prevent them from seeking help from police or healthcare when they need it.
Oh, I see.
So it's a complicated issue with no easy answers.
It sounds like okay, so there's no one feminist stance on prostitution.
Right. And then you have some feminists who are against it, even if it's voluntary.
Okay.
They emphasize sexual autonomy and say that the demand for commercial sex is exploitative.
Okay.
They worry about the commodification of intimacy and the potential for harm,
Right.
but they also recognize that criminalization can be harmful too.
So it's about weighing those harms.
Exactly. And then radical feminists tend to take an abolitionist stance.
Okay.
They say prostitution is inherently about sexual subordination and reinforces patriarchy. And more recent analysis is looking at other forms of exploitation in the sex industry, too.
So it's a very multifaceted issue.
It is. Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about pornography and obscenity.
Okay, another hot button issue.
Yeah, and one where feminists are divided right from the start on how to even define pornography.
Right, what counts as pornography?
Exactly. Is it any sexually explicit material, or does it have to involve objectification, misogyny, subordination?
Right.
And then there's the legal distinction between pornography and obscenity,
Right.
which adds another layer of complexity.
Okay.
So liberal feminists often defend freedom of expression and argue against censorship.
Yeah.
But other feminists are worried about the harms of pornography.
Right.
They say it can promote harmful attitudes and contribute to violence against women.
Okay.
And globally, you see a huge range in how pornography is regulated.
Right. Some countries are much more restrictive than others.
Exactly. Some have strict censorship laws, others are more permissive.
Okay.
Child pornography is widely condemned, and there are laws against it.
Right. But for adult pornography, there's a lot of variation.
Yeah.
And the U.S. has been a major battleground for these debates.
Okay.
You have civil libertarians who oppose censorship.
Right.
And then dominance feminists like McKinnon and Dworkin who see pornography as a form of sex discrimination.
Okay.
They argue that it objectifies women and encourages harmful attitudes.
Right.
And they actually proposed a civil rights ordinance that would have allowed victims to sue producers and distributors.
Wow.
But it was struck down by the Supreme Court in American Booksellers Association v. Hudnut.
Okay.
The court said it violated the First Amendment because it was regulating speech based on content.
I see.
But supporters of the ordinance said the court misunderstood their argument.
Okay.
They said it wasn't about moralism, it was about stopping the subordination of women.
Right.
And they called for better models of masculinity.
So a shift in how we think about men and relationships.
Exactly. And after Hudnut, some liberal legal scholars like Sunstein and Kagan started to support laws against speech that causes direct harm. Okay, so a bit of a shift there.
Yeah. But radical feminists still critique that whole public-private distinction.
Right, because they say harm can happen in private too.
Exactly. And then you have the whole new challenge of AI and robotic technologies,
Right.
which can create incredibly realistic simulations of sexual acts.
Deep fakes and things like that.
Exactly. And that raises a whole new set of ethical and legal questions.
Yeah, because it's not clear how those should be regulated.
Right. It's a really rapidly evolving area.
Okay, so let's talk about sexual harassment and the Me Too movement.
Okay. So Catherine McKinnon's work in 1979 won groundbreaking.
Okay.
She identified sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination,
Right.
which was huge in terms of getting legal recognition for this problem.
And that helped to address what Miranda Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice.
Exactly. The idea that people didn't even have the concepts to understand and talk about this experience.
Right.
So that was a big step forward.
It was. But there are still debates about how to define sexual harassment.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Like Vicky Schultz argues that it should be understood as conduct that excludes women from masculinized workplaces.
Okay.
And then you have the Me Too movement in 2017.
Right, which brought a lot of attention to sexual harassment and assault.
It did, and it really focused on the behavior of powerful men.
Yeah, Harvey Weinstein, Andrew Cuomo, David Warburton, all those cases.
Exactly. But it also sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah, about due process for the accused versus believing victims.
Exactly. There's this tension between those two things.
And the movement has faced a lot of backlash, too.
It has, especially in the U.S.
So it's been really impactful, but also really controversial.
Definitely. Okay, let's talk about domestic violence.
Okay, another really important and sensitive topic.
It is. And for a long time, women didn't have much legal protection from intimate partner violence.
Right, because of that whole idea of the home as a private sphere.
Exactly. And feminist scholarship has been really important in changing that.
Yeah.
But despite all the progress, rates of domestic violence are still very high globally.
Yeah, the World Health Organization released some alarming statistics on that in 2021.
Right. And the question of how to address this legally is really complicated.
Yeah, especially when you consider all the different experiences of victims and the potential for unintended consequences.
Exactly. So in the 1960s, the feminist movement against domestic violence made some important advances.
Okay.
They recognized it as a form of male control and pushed for things like criminalization shelters, mandatory arrest policies.
Okay, so a lot of focus on the criminal justice system.
Right. But more recently, there's been a critique of that over-reliance on law enforcement.
Okay.
Some people worry about escalation, discriminatory treatment over policing.
Yeah.
And there's data from the U.S. showing increased arrests of both victims and perpetrators.
So the system isn't always helping.